Hey kiddos, I wanted to do a quick first chapter Tuesday because today when I talked to one of my 6th grade classes and said something about one of the books that I read, and it was the 4th book in the series of the Sideways stories from Wayside School, and I said, oh, how many of you have read that? And literally no one had read it. And it is one of my very favorite books. There were 3 of them, and now there is a 4th one, a brand new 4th one. And so I'm actually doing a first chapter Tuesday. I'm hoping lots of you have read Sideways Stories from Wayside School. It is amazing. It's hilarious. It's funny. Super short chapters, and I know we all love super short chapters. So this is what it says on the back. There's been a terrible mistake. Wayside School was supposed to be built with 30 classrooms all next to each other in a row. Instead, the classrooms were stacked one on top of the other, 30 stories tall. The builder said he was very sorry for the mistake. That's probably the reason all kinds of wacky things happen at Wayside School, especially on the 30th floor. That's where you'll meet Miss Gorf, the meanest teacher in the whole school, before she turned into an apple and was replaced by Mrs. Jules, who has her own special way of teaching arithmetic. The kids are a weird bunch too, from Big Mouth Jason to Stinky Sammy to Sweet and Pretty Mauricia, who can beat up any boy in the class. You'll never guess Allison's secret or figure out how mean Mrs. Gorf came back to haunt the kids on the 30th floor. But you will discover the funniest, craziest, most mixed up place that ever called itself a school. And the 2nd book is Wayside School is Falling Down, and the 3rd book is Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger. And then, like I said, they just released a brand new 4th book. So this is the very beginning. So I'm going to read it to you, and you get to watch Edgar sleep in the background while I do this first chapter Tuesday. Meet some of the kids from Wayside School. Todd isn't really bad. He just always gets caught, and he gets sent home early every single day. BB is the fastest draw in the art class. She can draw a cat in 45 seconds, but she never draws just one. DJ always has a smile on his face, and no one knows why. John is the smartest boy in the class, but he can only read words that are written upside down. Kathy hates everybody in Mrs. Jules' class and everyone else in the world. And there are plenty more strange characters you'll love the mix at this mixed up school. And there are 30 stories, so 30 levels of Wayside School. There are also 30 chapters. And each chapter is somebody different at the school. So the introduction says, this book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them each, there is something you ought to know so you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. Now, it was only supposed to be 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it's 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school because they have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly, and that is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. And that is probably also true. Chapter 1 is Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'm going to wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add, he couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple just for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf then wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anyone else have an opinion, she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I do not allow crying in the classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't really have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. She reached the door. Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Louis, the art teacher, walked into the classroom. He missed the children at recess. He heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He just walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the art teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the whole world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore, and I don't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs anymore. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and he bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor and the apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears. This time, first her left, then her right. Turn the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia, let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears. First her right, then her left. She stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the art teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf, he asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, I'm hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. So that's the first chapter of Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Chapter 2 is Mrs. Jewls, and that is their new teacher. And then each chapter you get to meet the kids from the class. So this is Joe, and then you get to meet Sherry. You see that one? And like I said, there's 30 chapters, so you get to meet all the kids. You need to read this book. Super, super awesome. So that is first chapter Tuesday. Edgar is still sleeping. Yes, but he loves you. Bye, kiddos. See you later.